Well, it's nearing October, and I don't know about the rest of you, but I feel like celebrating the Halloween season early the only way I know how. Recently, I've come across a few dinosaur horror and thriller short stories, and I figured now was the perfect time to break them out and tell you guys about them. So, grab your shitty pumpkin spice latte drink, ignore all of your responsibilities for the next 30 or so minutes, and enjoy this random video on dinosaur horror stories. No Place Like Home. Our first story comes from an anthology book called Dead Time Stories, which came out in October of 1987 and is a collection of all sorts of fun and scary horror-related stories and art about werewolves, giant bugs, eldritch monsters, and of course, dinosaurs. One of the stories, titled No Place Like Home, was written by Suzanne Lord, who I couldn't really find anything on, and illustrated by Stephen R. Bissett, who you may know through his dinosaur-oriented comic book called Tyrant. The two came together to create this little comic short story, which is set in the future where time travel is not only possible, but also available to the public for recreational use. As a result, people view it as a tourist venture of sorts, using it to travel to certain points in history to visit for a short period of time, kind of like a vacation, before returning to the present. Of course, there do seem to be some general rules in place for time traveling, you know, don't destroy anything, don't bring anything back, and so on. Despite being available to the public, the fee to pay for time travel is still quite expensive, as $500 can only get you a half a day in the machine. But this is what our main character, Henry, saves up for, as he's tired of his mother's nagging, as you can see in this panel of her shouting at him for the millionth time to close the door when he enters the house. And he hopes to use the machine to get away from her for a little while. So he takes his money that he's earned through work and uses it to pay for a half a day inside the machine, where in order to get as far away from all humans as possible, he decides to visit where, you know, any normal functioning human would want to go. In the past 100 million years BC to see the dinosaurs. So he pays his fee, enters the time machine, and prepares to head to the past. When he exits the machine, he's greeted by some hideous and monstrous looking dinosaurs. But you know, hideous and monstrous in a good way. There's something about Bissett's art style that I really like. It really makes the dinosaurs look just a bit terrifying, but at the same time, they look really cool as well. Henry is then swooped from the ground by an ugly looking pterosaur, but then he gets killed by another bigger pterosaur in midair, sending Henry to fall back down to the ground on the foliage. To get away from the chaos, Henry finds a secluded spot that also holds a nest of giant dinosaur eggs, to which Henry decides to cook up and eat. Too bad Henry didn't really think this through, because it turns out the nest belonged to a now very pissed off T-Rex mother, who then chases Henry back to the time machine. He makes it just in time, but makes a very fatal mistake. He didn't heed his mother's warning from the beginning of the book, because once again, Henry forgot to shut the damn door, this time to the time machine. The comic ends with the time machine making it back to the present, but what comes out of it is the T-Rex that had just got done eating Henry. It's a short entry, and there's not too much here to say anything about, but it's one of those more funny, campy kind of scary stories more than anything else. It's accompanied by some really cool dinosaur art, and what results of these two elements is a simple but funny little tale about a boy who didn't listen to his mother and suffered the consequences. The lesson of the story? There is no lesson. Personally, this is how I think everyone should strive to be. Disobey your parents so you can go back in time and see some dinosaurs. So real quick before we move on to the next story, like I said earlier, the Dead Time Stories book features not just short stories from various authors, but also different pieces of art by different illustrators. Some of this art accompanies the story, but there's a section that's specifically dedicated to one-off pieces of art made by several talented illustrators, including comic book writer and artist Arthur Adams, who made this really cool piece titled Dinosaur Terror that features in this segment of the book. It showcases some kind of armored monster or demon maybe riding an infected, possibly zombified theropod dinosaur, maybe a ceratosaur of some kind. It's a really cool piece of art that just randomly showed up in the same anthology book, so I figured I'd just give it a quick mention before moving on. Gator. I didn't realize it, but Robert J. Sawyer actually has a couple of dinosaur short stories that completely fell under my radar. What's funnier is that these couple of short stories that I've completely missed out on featured in his Iterations book, which is the book that I've used in the past for my Quintaglio Ascension Trilogy video and my Just Like Old Times video. I've had this book this entire time since then that's held these couple of dinosaur short stories, and I had no idea they existed until more recently. Gator is one of these short stories, and probably one of his weirdest ones yet. In 1997, Sawyer was approached by Josephus Sherman, an American author who's written several novels ranging from science fiction, fantasy, and even a bit of horror. This specific project that she was approaching Sawyer about was for a horror fantasy anthology book called Urban Nightmares, that she was editing with Keith R.A. DiCandido, where the stories in it were all supposed to be based around urban legends, and she wanted him to participate. So Sawyer decided to write his story around the gators in the sewers of New York myth, but also added a bit of a science fiction twist to it. The story begins with a sewer worker by the name of Paul Kowalski, who is rushed to the hospital after being attacked by something in the tunnel systems under New York City. As they brought him into the emergency room on a gurney, he claimed to have been attacked by a gator. Whatever it was that attacked him took a large chunk out of his thigh, and he was losing blood quickly. Dennis Jacobs, the surgeon on duty, managed to stop the bleeding and patched Kowalski up, but during the process, one of the doctors pulls out a tooth from the wound. This tooth, coupled with what Kowalski said earlier about alligators in the sewers, puzzles Jacobs. So a couple of days later, he goes and sees a colleague of his for a second opinion on the matter. His colleague was a professor who worked at the American Museum of Natural History, and when he hears Jacobs' story, he's in disbelief. Despite Kowalski's claims, Professor Chong, Jacob's colleague, isn't convinced that an alligator would even be able to survive in the New York sewers, but Jacobs shows him the tooth that was extracted from Kowalski's wound. Chong inspects it, concluding that it wasn't an alligator's tooth. He didn't know exactly what animal this tooth belonged to, but he did know it wasn't an alligator's tooth because it didn't look like one. With that, Jacobs goes to leave the museum, but as he passes the fossil exhibit, featuring all sorts of dinosaurs on display, he notices that his tooth bears a huge resemblance to one of the dinosaur skeletons, more specifically, the Tyrannosaurus rex. The tooth he had matches almost completely with that of the fossilized dinosaur's tooth, the only difference being the color. Jacob's tooth was newer and white, while the T-Rex tooth was aged and brown. Jacobs couldn't believe what he was seeing, so he goes over to the front desk of the museum and asks to talk to a paleontologist. Soon, he's met with by David Ludlam, the museum's paleontologist, who examines Jacobs' tooth, confirming it to be a theropod tooth. Of course, this was hard to believe considering dinosaurs had been dead for millions of years, but when Ludlam is filled in on the story about the sewer worker that was attacked by what he claimed to be an alligator, the paleontologist asked to talk to the patient himself. So, Ludlam and Jacobs go back to the hospital and questions Kowalski on his encounter with the animal that day in the sewers. While Kowalski is convinced that he was attacked by a gator, his description of the animal is quite strange. The animal had no arms and only stood on its hind legs, and its eyes were yellow with black and round pupils. Kowalski chalks this up to be some sort of birth defect, but Ludlam is convinced that whatever attacked him in the sewers was not a gator. So he toys around with the idea of it being a dinosaur, telling Jacobs that alligators had vertical pupils while theropod dinosaurs did not. And as far as the no arms claim goes, given T-Rex's arms were already small and useless to the animal, it probably reached a point in evolution where they lost their arms completely. However, Ludlam wanted visual evidence of this, and for the following weeks, he would make trips into the sewers to try and find the creature himself to verify if what they're dealing with was actually a dinosaur. But for a while, all that Ludlam was able to find were homeless people, the occasional sanitation department worker, and a strange electrical phenomenon. One night, as he was continuing his search in the sewers, he notices a strange green light in front of him. The The phenomenon is known as piezoelectricity, which is when mechanical stress is submitted to certain materials, like crystals, that in turn cause electrical energy. And the heavy skyscrapers of the city are putting unimaginable force onto the rocks within the sewers, causing the stress that would then cause the illuminating of the material. At one point, the light grows brighter, and soon, Ludlam can see the outline of something big and reptilian. It was the dinosaur that had attacked Kowalski, but it didn't look exactly like a T-Rex. It didn't have any arms, as Kowalski accurately described, but the dinosaur's cranium was enlarged, bigger than the normal T-Rex's head. Ludlam concludes that this creature was a Tyrannosaurus, but one of a different timeline, one that evolved to have no arms and gained high intelligence. Despite its intelligence, the T-Rex still seemed to be somewhat feral, but it didn't attack Ludlam. Instead, it just looked at him curiously. What was also strange about the dinosaur was that it came out of nowhere, as if it had materialized into thin air, likely caused by the electrical occurrence that must have interfered with the two timelines. Ludlam slowly goes up to the dinosaur and touches it as it begins to fade away. Before he knew it, Ludlam, since he had made physical contact with the dinosaur during the transfer, was dragged out of his timeline and brought into the dinosaur's world. No longer was he in New York City. Instead, he was in a primordial setting, in a timeline where dinosaurs didn't go extinct. The T-Rex in this timeline may have been more intelligent than its prehistoric counterpart, but it was not technologically advanced either. However, Ludlam seemed far from bothered. After all, he was in a paleontologist's dream to be in a time where dinosaurs still existed. He grinned after this realization, but the T-Rex is no longer friendly and chases the scientist up a tree. But this doesn't dampen Ludlam's excitement. The story ends with Ludlam planning to make friends with the T-Rex so that he can learn more about its world and the history of dinosaurian evolution. According to Sawyer, Sherman and DeCandido loved this story so much, they decided to put it first in their anthology book Urban Nightmares. And I can see why. When I first heard about this story, I wasn't actually expecting there to be any dinosaurs at all, so it was a bit of a surprise that out of all the dinosaurs that could have been picked for the stand-in for gators in the story, it was a Tyrannosaurus Rex. I find it a little hard to believe a T-Rex could be confused with an alligator, but I guess New York people have a skill issue in being observant or, having any kind of common sense. All jokes aside, it was kind of funny to see this gator in the sewer story go from 0 to 100 real quick with the reveal that it ended up not just being a T-Rex, but a T-Rex that was evolved and intelligent and from a different timeline. It's so crazy to me, and I think that's why I like it so much. It started out as this somewhat grounded urban legend story, but then we end it with a materializing T-Rex from a time where dinosaurs didn't go extinct. Very good story, highly recommend it. Rex. For our final story, we have another short one, but it's also very unique. This suggestion was actually emailed to me a while back ago by a Robin C. I never got a chance to respond to the email because sometimes I'll read them, but I won't respond right away because I'll save it for later when I have a better time to sit down and write it out, and then I'll just completely forget about it for one reason or another. So I apologize for not responding sooner to this email, but I do read them. I do try to take in as many suggestions as possible, and I'm glad I decided to visit this one because I very much like the concept to this story, that being a sighting of a dinosaur apparition. In 1990, American author and magazine editor Jeff Rovin would gather a collection of 50 American ghost stories made by various different authors that were made within a span of the last 500 years of the country's history and compiled them into a book titled The Spirits of America. The very last story in this collection was titled Rex, and it was featured last on purpose because, according to the book's introduction, these 50 stories were put in chronological order by the date they occurred in, and Rex is labeled to have occurred sometime in 1987, the most recent to the book's publication date. The story is revolved around amateur paleontologist Hilary Townsend, who visits the Grand Canyon to inspect a strange discovery. Carved onto the wall of the canyon are ancient man-made friezes or molds that depict a Tyrannosaurus Rex. This surprises Townsend because these friezes dated back to the early days of man, well before any could have a clear view of what a Tyrannosaurus would look like, an animal that had been dead for millions of years prior. Yet, the carving existed, and it could be argued that maybe this was just a piece made from the imagination of the ancient artist. But Townsend thinks that the carving and the real-life depictions of the dinosaur are too exact for this to be a coincidence. But before she could come to any real conclusion on the matter, the day eventually comes to an end, and Townsend decides to call it for the night and returns to her small campsite where she prepares a fire and a meal for her and her German Shepherd dog, Rex, who usually accompanied her on trips like these. As the sun sets, suddenly Rex begins to sense something that ends up scaring him under Townsend's truck. Thinking it to be some kind of animal too close to her camp, she takes out her pistol and inspects the area. Considering the kind of landscape she's in, it would be hard for any predators to hide, and yet she saw nothing. Then she heard a strange sound, a deep, almost guttural-like sound, along with scenting a strange smell, one that's described as rank and oily. But the direction they both came from showed nothing. Maybe the sound was coming from an animal in a cave nearby, where its tunnels were enhancing the calls to sound closer than they actually were. But then, she notices a very strange phenomenon, one that she couldn't really explain. About a few hundred yards in front of her and reaching up to 20 feet from the ground stood a series of abnormal heat waves. They're described in the story as rippling vertically and not horizontally. And then they began to grow thicker, where they then displayed a yellowish hue with patches of brown forming here and there within it. Eventually, the waves would thicken into a familiar form, one that she had looked at not too long ago. Before she knew it, what was standing a few hundred feet in front of Townsend was an adult Tyrannosaurus Rex. The jaws were closed, the mouth curving up in the back in what looked like a smile, but definitely wasn't. The unctuous smell was overpowering now, but she was too stunned to move. The creature's eyes were upon her as it bent forward slowly, its thick tail straightened and rising behind it as a counterbalance. When its body was nearly parallel to the ground, the enormous beast came forward, shifting heavily from leg to leg, the limbs rising like enormous pistons. Each step brought its feet to the ground with a loud thud that kicked up clouds of dry earth. The claws of its feet were chipped and yellowing, those of the hands somewhat cleaner. When it opened its mouth, she saw that the 6-inch teeth were cleaner still. Then it roared, and she forgot everything, including her name. But before the dinosaur reached her, the waves would ripple it out of existence, leaving Townsend standing there in shock of what she had just witnessed. She would be brought out of her trance by her dog Rex, who was able to come out from under the truck now that the scent of the animal was gone. This indicated that the dog had also noticed this very strange occurrence, meaning Townsend was not just imagining things. At least, that's the explanation she comes up with. The following day, the scientists would walk around the area that she had seen the Tyrannosaurus Rex in, searching for any kind of evidence of its appearance, though nothing, not even footprints or tracks, were left behind from the encounter. She then spent the day studying the frieze again, and later that night, waiting with a camera in case the Tyrannosaurus showed up again. This time, she would get proof of her experience, but nothing happened. The T-Rex would never show up again. Townsend tries to come up with some kind of explanation for this phenomenon, concluding that maybe this T-Rex was an entity or apparition, with its sighting being the result of what the story describes as a ghostly radio dial being spun from a spectral broadcast, if you will. And maybe this spectral broadcast encompasses all of time and space, leading to some interference happening between points in time, and in turn, leading to the T-Rex appearing in modern day, but in all actuality, Townsend wasn't completely sure of this. But she was sure that she saw the T-Rex and that the ancient artist who had made the frieze on the canyon wall had the same experience and documented it through their carvings. This was a very interesting story, and I really liked it. There's a lot to it that's so mysterious, which is fitting because dinosaurs as a whole give off that mysterious vibe due to the fact that we've just never seen them in the flesh before. At least, non-avian dinosaurs or You know what I'm talking about. As far as any other kind of explanation for the story, aside from the 1987 label, there's no specific date or author attached to it. However, Rovin does point out in the introduction of this book, while the names of a few towns or participants have been changed to protect their privacy, all of the encounters have been carefully researched. Several of the stories were culled from contemporary magazine and newspaper articles and from books long out of print. Many were related by the participants themselves, or by residents of the towns where the older hauntings took place. All of them happened as described, and any one of them can happen again. The possibility of a story about a dinosaur ghost being real sounded really interesting, and I tried to look a bit more into it with no real luck finding anything. And considering the person in the story is likely a fake name, not to mention this story could have just been a completely fictional tale rather than an actual recorded sighting, that only made searching anything relating to this story more difficult. And if this was a fictional story, which is likely, and it was pulled from a magazine or a newspaper or a book, that means the original version of it is probably out there somewhere. But again, couldn't really find much on it. And even if I did, who knows if it would even be that much different. Like Rovin said earlier in his introduction, the only thing he would change are the names and towns, and that's only for a few of the stories. He doesn't ever specify which stories they are, so Rex could be one of those stories, or maybe it's not. I don't really know. Overall though, I really like this story. It was very short though. I guess maybe the original story, or possibly sighting, wasn't a very long experience, but regardless, it's still an intriguing story. Well, those were a few dinosaur horror stories that I've come across in the last couple of months. I hope you guys enjoyed them. Let me know what your favorite one was down in the comments below. I'm interested to see since they all have a pretty different approach from one another. One is a campy time travel story, the other is a sci-fi spin on a popular New York City myth, and the last one is a dinosaur ghost story. All very interesting. As always, if you guys have any more suggestions for stories like these, definitely let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to make another video like this. Before I go, I just want to say real quick that I do have a bigger Halloween related special planned for next month. I know I don't usually tease my projects that much in videos, but that's mainly because there's always a chance they won't happen for one reason or another, and I don't like getting people's hopes up. But I'm pretty confident in this one. I've been doing a lot of research on the topic, and it's one that a lot of people have been wanting me to do for a while, and I'm excited to finally be exploring it for October. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all so much for watching this video, and please, have a nice day.